My pleasure tonight to introduce you to my father, our speaker, Dr. Edmund W. Gordon. And I actually have his bio here in front of me. And I'll read some of it, but I'll also put in some personal things, I guess. And I'm also waiting for my mother, who's here, too, who will be joining us in a few minutes. So Edmund W. Gordon is actually the John M. Musser Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Yale University and the John March Ho Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Education at Columbia Teachers College. He's also Director Emeritus of the Institute for Urban and Minority Education at Columbia Teachers College, which he was the founder of, and he's a Senior Research Scholar in Residence at SUNY Rockland Community College. He just finished 2 years serving as the chairperson of the Gordon Commission on the Future of Assessment Education at ETS. And he is the author of more than 200 articles, over 20 books. What else should I tell you? So, he has a distinguished career that has spanned scholarly life. He started out as a minister, then he was a clinical and counseling psychologist, a research scientist, author, editor, and professor. He has held appointments at several of the nation's leading universities, including Howard, Yeshiva, Columbia, City University of New York, Yale. He's been a visiting professor at City College and Harvard University. From 2000 to 2001, he was actually Vice President for Academic Affairs and Interim Dean of Faculty at Teachers College, Columbia University. He is also one of the founders and was the first research director of Head Start in the 1960s. He and my mother, Dr. Susan Gordon, founded a clinic in Harlem in the 50s. Called the Harriet Tubman Clinic for free health and mental health services. They also are the co-founders with my siblings and I of the CGIS Institute and the Charles White Gallery, which is out in Rockland County in Pomona, New York. He has been named one of America's most prolific and thoughtful scholars. He has received several honorary degrees, including one that he and my mother received from Mount Holyoke College. And he has been married to my mother for almost 68 years. And sorry she isn't here yet. I was trying to hold off on that one. And they claim their most important achievement to be myself and my 3 siblings. So I think I'll end it there. If you really want to know what else, I think I actually wrote the introduction to the first volume of his memoir, which is called Pedagogic Imagination. And so you can read the rest there. He is insisting that I can't tell him what to say tonight, so I gave him some guidelines. We'll see how far he follows them. But as you see, he really likes the Socratic method, and he wants people to dialogue. So I think this may be the only revolving mic, right? So we'll try to keep up when the time comes, but he does have some opening remarks to make. And I'm supposed to also announce next week's, on March 3rd, in L63 new building, we will have Peter Yarrow will be doing reflections on the 60s and a concert. And please help me welcome Dr. Edmund W. Gordon.
Thank you, Professor Gordon Nimhart, and thanks for inviting me. If you want to have a curriculum that is long as mine, you have to live a long time. And I've been around a long time. I retired from Yale in 1991 and have managed to keep active since then. I guess my other quick piece of advice is that if you want to live a long time, try to keep busy. I seem to have made it for almost 93 years and have, please come in, and have not had much time that was wasted. My wife just appeared, and I was hoping she'd come on in. So if you, oh, maybe she's coming this way. Let's see what else unimportant I can say until she gets here. I should tell you that I wish the room was set up a little differently so that I was in the middle. For the last 15 years of my active career, I pretty much stopped lecturing because I don't think people can listen really actively too long. I prefer conversations, exchanges. I've passed around a little sheet that is not enough for all of you to see, but it's pretty much going to includes most of the points I'm going to hit on. If you've also had a chance to read a paper that Professor Nembhard shared, this is Dr. Susan Gordon. Lady who deserves a lot of credit for putting up with me for 68 years. It was in 1946 that both of us happened to be in Omaha, Nebraska. She was there for 6 weeks and I was there for 6 months. And we fell in love and somehow have been a pair ever since. I'm not sure I advise choosing your life's mate that quickly, but it certainly worked for us. I've never had an unhappy day for that. All right. What I was saying, I prefer to have give and take rather than ask you to sit here for an hour and listen to me. Plus the fact that my age, I'm not sure I can hold forth for an hour anymore. So I need you to talk. So if you look at that little sheet I turned around, I passed around, or if you read the essay that Professor Nembhard circulated, I'm willing to talk about any of the things that you see there and the few things that are not there. If there's anything that particularly intrigues you and you want me to talk about, please make your comment about it. You ought not try to make the speech for me, but questions will be welcomed, or comments. On that sheet, at the top of the page, there is an excerpt from a state Supreme Court decision from 1849. And as best as I can determine, that was one of the first school desegregation cases in the nation. I spent most of my life thinking that the action in the 40s that led to the decision in 54 was really the kind of beginning of this struggle for access to quality education. But back in the mid-19th century, the city of Boston had created its system of public education. It had maybe 100 schools in the city. There was no requirement for the attendance at any one of them except that you live in Boston. Because black people at that time were unwelcomed in public schools, they designated, I think it was 4 or 5 of those schools for colored children. And a chap named Brown wanted his daughter to go to the school that was closest to them, and it happened to be one of the white schools. And they went into court at that time arguing for the right for her to attend the public school. And sure enough, the courts ruled that the Constitution of Massachusetts at that time required that anybody in Boston attend the school closest to them. And this was the school that was closest to this child. And interestingly enough, they ruled that there was nothing in the Constitution that gave the right of the state or the school system to refuse admission to public services to anybody who was a citizen of Massachusetts. And as you read that excerpt that I gave you from that court ruling, it could have been written in the 1950s or 60s, and for some parts of this country, it actually should be written and reinterpreted and promulgated even now, because despite the fact that in 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that public schools could not be discriminatory in their admission of students. The chap out at UCLA who heads a school desegregation research group claims that our schools are more segregated in, 2000, I've lost where we were, 2014, than we were before 1954. So anyway, I begin my notes with that, and I go on to give you some kind of landmarks for developments in the 150-year struggle for equal access to good education in this country. Most of it has been dominated by concern for racial, I wouldn't call it integration, but at least racial desegregation throughout the latter part of the 19th century. There was a struggle among poor white people and recently freed enslaved people simply to get public schools. And shortly after we won that battle, that is public schools throughout the nation, the schools in the South, or the people of color in the South, started arguing for access to good quality schools. It wasn't even dreamed of in those days that we would struggle to desegregate schools. The pattern of racial separation was so well established by the turn of the century that what we were really asking for was access to good schools. Many people thought at that time that if there were not the racial barrier that would give people of color access to good schools, because if they were in the same schools with white folk, they would get better education. But because of the Plessy-Ferguson, is that it? Decision, which instantiated for a while separate but equal as meeting the constitutional requirement for equal treatment. What we concentrated on was trying to make the black schools as good as the white schools. I remember in my childhood, there was a rash of activity down in North Carolina, just trying to bring the physical plants of public schools up to par, because the schools for black kids were very, very, very inferior to the schools for white kids. The next struggle was the struggle to equalize teachers' salaries, because I can remember in elementary school, the black teachers were paid about half as much as white teachers. And in order to get their incomes up, they had to add graduate credits. They had to add course credits, because from almost the beginning of public schools, teachers have been paid in part in relation to their preparation, their training. this became a kind of sore point because the white teachers at that time, who didn't have to be as well educated in order to earn a livable salary, didn't get all that extra education. When we finally won the struggle for the equalization of teachers' salaries, white teachers began to protest because the black teachers were making more than the white teachers. And that was because, by and large, the black teachers were better educated than the white teachers. And it wasn't just the earlier pattern of discrimination with respect to pay. It was also the nature of the society at that time. There were not many things black people could do that brought them livable wages in the labor force. And for black women, teaching was about the only thing that they could do, so that you have attracted to the teaching profession for black women a attraction that teaching did not hold for white women, because there were other opportunities open to white women. That pattern actually has continued, and even to this day, one could argue that you are likely to find attracted to education people of color who, I don't want to be derogatory with respect to white women who teach, because there are a lot of excellent white women who teach, but the opportunities for white women in the labor force are such that fewer of them turn to education by default proportionately than do black women who turn to education by default. So that segregation in the schools, discriminatory treatment, not only influence the education of the students, it influenced the quality of career opportunities for the more privileged group. And in fact, it provided career opportunities for black people. As I was growing up in this period, if you could get a teaching job or a civil service job or a job on the Pullman car porters, you were propelled into the black middle class, because this is where consistent job opportunities for people of color existed. There were broader opportunities for other people. Anyway, that was this, and I'm going to stop my rambling and let you focus my comments in a couple of minutes. Through this period before, say, 1950, there were these struggles to somehow gain access to quality education for black people. And at that time, it was prior to the more recent migrations of Latino folk into this country, so that the struggle was primarily a black-white one. And it was against that background that Thurgood Marshall and Jim Nabrit and Bob Carter and a group of remarkable attorneys spent 10 years preparing for what it was eventually the Supreme Court decision of 1954 that ruled segregation in public schools illegal. Now, when I came to New York first time in 1950, I was a graduate student up at Teachers College, and Goodwin Watson, who was a professor of social psychology, was looking for students who wanted to who would be willing to help a young assistant professor at City College who was trying to prepare a social science brief that Marshall and the other lawyers who were preparing for the 54 decision, that case, Topeka versus Brown versus Topeka, who were trying to prepare that case to go before the Supreme Court. These lawyers had determined that the provisions of the Constitution that required that public services, that government had to provide equal opportunities for all citizens. They thought that that was the most vulnerable of that constitutional provision was not most vulnerable, but it made the system most vulnerable for attack. So they chose to develop the legal case challenging segregation, really the legal case in defense of our search for quality, for access to quality education. They chose to use race as the primary variable around which their arguments would be based. And when we met with Ken to talk about this brief he was trying to prepare, those of you who have a copy of my paper, there's a section that actually summarizes what they put in that brief. But when we met with Ken, he indicated that what he was simply trying to do was to sift through the available social science research that would support just three arguments. One was that segregation in public schools was harmful to black kids. The second was that such segregation was harmful for white kids. And the third was we were looking for evidence that would support the assertion that in social systems, if there are social structures that demand certain types of behavior, most of us would tend to comply with that behavior. And what was behind that notion was that if we could get the nation to take the state to take the position that segregation was illegal, most people would follow it. And sure enough, I think probably one of the biggest achievements of the civil rights movement around education, with race as its center, was just the establishment of that principle, that it was no longer legal, no longer constitutional for the state to require that people be separated by race. And that opened the door for lots of people in the country who wanted to be decent, who wanted to be law-abiding, to at least tolerate, if not accept, the desegregation of the society. Somewhere in the paper I circulated, I suggested that I thought the focus on race may have been a mistake, and I still think that. But it was a mistake for education. It was certainly not a mistake for the society at large, because it revolutionized a racist nation. It didn't do away with racism. It didn't do away with racial discrimination. But it did open the door to the nation for all of the people who kind of wanted to or were inclined to or who might feel a little bit uncomfortable about breaking the law. It opened the door for all of us to begin to follow the law. I jumped ahead to 2 points I was dealing with. One was my participation in the generation of this brief that is referred to as the Clark brief, and incidentally has legal importance, not only for its contribution to that particular decision, but it was the first time in the history of the court that the court had cited in its decision conclusions that were based upon social science research. So those of us scholars of the social sciences were quite excited, pleased, because in addition to having won the battle on the issue before the court, we won a place, an acceptable place in the Supreme Court for the kind of research that we were doing. And Ken and the several scholars who prepared that brief were really quite astute, because the empirical evidence was really kind of wobbly, based largely on Ken and Mamie Clark's early research. They call it the doll study, where they were able to demonstrate that black kids tended to choose white dolls, and they to prefer white dolls, and they inferred from those findings that that was a reflection of a damaged self-identity, denying self to embrace actually the opposition. There were a few other little studies of that sort, but none of them met what is now thought of as the gold standard for research. Controlled, randomly selected comparisons. The evidence on the negative impact on white kids was even weaker, and you had to kind of bend a little bit to the left to support the third of those arguments, that people are so docile that they will follow the law, whatever the law is. And certainly if we had the benefit of the data available since the decision on desegregation, we see that while a lot of us have taken advantage of the law to simply comply, we have found many, 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 many ways to break that law, to avoid that law. Up in Rockland County, where my wife and I live and have lived for almost 60 years, we're having a hell of a time keeping middle-class, affluent families in public schools. First, to avoid the integrated nature of those schools. Second, the claim that those schools are inferior to many of the private schools. And there's a religious isolation factor that is contributing to it. But all across the country, as we tried to enforce the 54 decision, we had what is called white flight. White folks leaving the desegregated public schools. I remember working down in Prince Edward County, Virginia. Virginia, after that decision, decided to repeal the provision of its state constitution that required that counties provide public education. They just took that out of the Constitution, so no county would be required to run a public school that would have to be desegregated. And the Christian churches of Virginia got together and opened up schools for children, for white children, that is. In the county that my colleagues and I went to work, Prince Edward County, the public schools were closed. There were Christian academies for white kids. And for 5 years, there were no schools for black kids. And Bobby Kennedy called one day to say that he had decided as Attorney General he was going to open the schools in Prince Edward County, and he wanted some of us to go down and do so. And we were able to do so. We enrolled that first year 1,806, I think it was, black kids and 3 white kids. And the 2 families that gave us those 3 white kids were chased out of town. So that even though the law was there, our assertion in that brief that getting the law in place would carry people with it certainly did not hold in areas like Prince Edward County, Virginia. But to offset the weakness of the research, what Ken came up with was the idea that he would get some of the most respected social scientists in the nation to sign the petition, indicating that they recognize the ambiguities, the weaknesses of the empirical research, but they, as scientists, believe those 3 assertions. And sure,
How about that? Try it.
okay. I was simply, got it? Okay. I was concluding that sure enough, the courts embraced the position that we had advanced in that brief. Now, I am not certain that the justices were actually convinced. As I look back on that period, I think that there were some other things going for us. If you remember, the United Nations was still a fledgling institution, and the United States was trying to assert its leadership. And some of us think that it was embarrassing to this country. It would have been embarrassing to this country for its highest court to have ruled in the opposite. And this mixture of very interesting judges, most of whom were not as liberal as Earl Warren, the Chief Justice. I get a echo. Do you get it? Okay. Most of whom were not as liberal as the then Supreme Court Justice Warren. But for them to agree on this, we think that they saw that it was in the national interest that we back away from this adherence to state-supported segregation and declare that simply off limits for us. But anyway, we won that one. I ought to stop talking there, but I need to make one other point, and I'm going to invite you to pitch in. I said a few minutes ago that I thought it was probably an error for education, and that grows out of my conviction that race is probably not the biggest problem in education. And it may be that we were so distracted by race and the struggle to get rid of segregation in schools, hoping that that was going to solve the problem, that we failed to remember that what brought us to race as the variable that we were focusing on was the search for education of high quality. So we gave very little attention to the relationship between academic achievement, the development of academic ability, what I like to call intellective competence. We gave very little attention to the relationship between that outcome and the other aspects of human lives. We had even in 1950, and we certainly have by 2000, just overwhelming evidence that if you want to know what's going to best predict academic achievement, check the family incomes of the kids who are being educated. As family income goes up, academic achievement goes up. As family income goes down, academic achievement goes down. But somehow we've not been willing to tackle that. And we discovered that it's not just money. A French political philosopher, Bourdieu, talks about education in relevant forms of capital, health, nutrition, other human beings, social networks. He's got a notion that I like. He calls it polity, a sense that I belong. If I feel that I belong, your values, what you're trying to do, interests me. If I feel that I don't belong, what you're about, your standards don't mean that much to me. And even worse, if you don't feel I belong, you don't give a damn about my education or my health or anything. So Bourdieu argues that these education-relevant forms of capital are the thing that is carrying the weight. Now race comes to be a surrogate for them, because in a racist society, your access to such capital is influenced by your race. But focusing on the race, I'm contending, may be an error, because to really change that set of phenomena, you've got to change access to those forms of capital. Let me stop there and let you talk.
Questions? Is this on?
Just a short question. Are you suggesting that Brown...
For some reason, your mic isn't working any better than mine.
Hello?
Yeah, that's better.
Hello, sir. Are you suggesting that Brown didn't do it? Are you suggesting Brown didn't do anything at all, or just didn't do enough?
Are you suggesting Brown didn't do anything at all, or just
No, not that at all. Hi, Brown.
You have to go back there. Because there you are speaking.
Oh, thank you.
Feedback.
Technology.
No, I'm not much of a religious person, but I thank the universe for Brown. That was a major decision. But I think it did more for the society. It did more for the nature of our nation than it did for education, because it spoke to the racial separation issue. And I don't think racial separation is the problem for education in our society. The problems lie in the way in which we deliver education and in the narrowness with which we interpret education. When I moved, and my wife and I moved out to Rockland County, it was in 1954. There are a lot of folk from the Lower East Side who moved out to the county about the same time. And I don't think many of you are here old enough to know what the Lower East Side was like from, right. That was a working class area. And when we moved out there, our neighbors used to come to town to go to Radio City. They read the daily news. They were lower class people. But they had accumulated enough money to move to the suburbs, so they began to think of themselves as middle class people. And over time they began to read the New York Times. They'd come into the city to go to the show. But it was no longer Radio City. They were going to the theater, or to the opera, or to a concert. Having the resources and the growing awareness of the cultural load that goes with being middle class, they lived different lives. And their kids, and Susan's and my kids, went to the Ivy League schools, the major state universities. They are acting like affluent people in this country do. And that was within a single generation. looking at the second, and I guess the youngest now would be third generation, that's continuing. So that the thing that I'm arguing is that the Brown decision didn't do anything for that relationship between access to the education forms of capital, although it did do something to change the nature of racial separation in society. And it even changed that more radically outside of school than inside of school. We have resegregated our kids in school, but we have desegregated the society in broader domains.
Good evening. Good evening. My question is, do you think the Brown versus Board of Education case has it disqualified this generation to argue the inequalities in education? Like saying, can we not argue that it's unconstitutional the way the education system is unequal because they already integrated schools?
I'm not well versed enough in the law to know all of the things that the Constitution provides. We have been trying for about 40 years now to get the courts to act on what we call the right to a good education. The closest we've come to winning that is that case that Mike Rebell brought here in New York State, in which he was able to demonstrate that the city of New York and the state of New York were underfunding education for Black and Latino and poor kids in New York City. But the state has found ways not to follow that court decision. I think we won something like $4 billion. And we are back in court now. It looks like we are in line to have the court award us something like $7 billion. But the tension now is between the decision from the court and the authority of the legislature to control the budget. If it goes to the current U.S. Supreme Court, it's so stacked with conservatives, I doubt that we will win it. But I do think that if we could establish the right to an adequate education as a civil right, we could be back in the court with a reasonable chance of winning if there's any fairness in the court itself. I doubt seriously that we could win it on race, and I must admit that if I were one of the scholars helping to make the case for race, for the decision based on race, I think I would have to decline. I'm not sure that race is so critical a factor that I would want to rally to the support of a decision based on race. There's a kind of complication there. Troy Duster, who's a professor of sociology down at NYU, asked the rhetorical question, how we can argue for racial equality and at the same time argue that the only way we can get equal education for black kids is to put them in classes with white kids. Is there something about whiteness now that enables black kids to learn? Or is there something about even being black that makes studying with white folk improve your academic achievement? The logical argument when we were pushing this case was that predominantly white schools were richer, were better, were higher quality schools. And we did have evidence that when the majority of kids in the school are high status and the minority is low status, the minority kids do perform more like the majority kids. But once the minority tips the balance and the higher status persons become the minority in that mix, the effect of the mix is lost. So it would be difficult, I think, in modern day to turn to the social sciences for the evidence to support the removal of racial distinctions as a vehicle for improving education. But we do know that when kids have access to the forms of capital that seem to enable schools to work, achievement goes up, and distinctions and the outcomes of schooling become much more balanced. So if I were making the case in modern times, I would try to find something in that domain. However, we are a capitalist nation, and the folk who defend capitalism are smart enough to know that that would require the redistribution of wealth. And we are not a society that's ready for that debate right now. Or, I shouldn't say that. The people who control this society are not ready for that debate, because the masses of people are beginning to recognize that if we don't do something about the redistribution of wealth, we are going to crash as a society. Yes, sir.
Oh, I was just going to say not to come forward.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Henry Delgado. My question was in regards to, as you were speaking about right to education and income equality compared to, those who aren't disenfranchised, essentially. How much you think, or do you think it's a better argument if we can bring to the courts the elimination of school zoning, because school zoning seems to be a way of segregating that educational capital, as you were speaking of. Do you think that would be a better form of arguing or a better approach to taking to the courts opposed to using race? Maybe school zoning, keeping kids in their school districts where they're failing throughout, as the pedigree of failure. Maybe if they got eliminated the school zoning, that would help with the educational equality.
I think anything that democratizes the society, including schools, is on the positive side. But I don't think changing the zoning patterns of schools will do it, because in this century, in the 21st century, I think our society, at least the folk who can afford it, have pretty much given up on public schools. And no matter how you zone them, they're going to be segregated, if not by race, by economic status. They're going to be underfunded. And more important, the culture is not going to support them in ways that carry, how shall I call it, an aspect of education that we have given insufficient attention to is the privilege assigned to intellect in the society, in the culture. And what we have done in this country is to make intellective competence, the privileging of mind and the control of mental processes and the use of mind in problem solving. We've made that the domain of the upper class, and too much of the middle class and most of the lower class is simply left out of that. So if I've got schools now where I've got a concentration of people who are not in the knowledge century, but are still maybe struggling with the skills century, no matter how you zone those schools, you're going to be in trouble. So what we've got to do is to first broaden the notion of education from schooling to life, to the things that help to make me an adequate and intellectually and socially competent person. And all of that doesn't happen in school. And if I can make it so much a part of the culture that it is harder for you to pick up your kids and run to a private place to have them educated, because it is ingrained in the politics. It's ingrained in the media. Some years ago, I was asked to do a study down in Montgomery County, Maryland, a rather affluent suburb of Washington, D.C. And they were troubled because in that community, even though money didn't seem to be a problem, equality in school achievement was. And one of the recommendations I added to the recommendations, knowing that they wouldn't be as taken seriously, was the recommendation that maybe the Board of Education needed to control the media, needed to license the TV and radio and newspapers and make them educated forces. Because what was happening in that country, in that county, was they were doing a reasonably good job in school. But in that affluent county, kids were learning so much other stuff outside of school that the kids who usually get left out, the domestic workers in Montgomery County, simply weren't doing well in school because they weren't getting the benefit of the richness of the culture in the community that they lived, which I believe is as important a part of the education as our schooling, as our schools. I've got 2 books on the subject. One, Supplementary Education, and in it I talk about the activities, the kinds of things that happen outside of school that reinforce, maybe even enable schools to work. In one of the group meetings we had around it, a rather wise woman stood up to ask a question, and she was really giving me advice. And she said, you know, Professor Gordon, I think you got it wrong. Schools are supplementary to what you're talking about. Schools supplement the richness of the lives that some of us live, and they try to help with the paucity of the lives that many other people live. So zoning wouldn't solve the problem.
More.
Hello. Can you hear me? All right. I wanted to ask if you agree that, given all points made thus far, that we're a society that isn't ready to redistribute the wealth, that we're a society that is more segregated now than we were then, yet still given the provisions made by the Constitution and these cases throughout the course of history, that perhaps we can or should recommend the same way that we standardize the test or the actual curriculum of the education, we standardize the quality and, I don't want to say luxuries, but amenities that come with the education, i.e. I went to school in Brooklyn as well as in the suburbs. And in the suburbs, I had an Olympic-sized pool. I had a field to learn my strengths and become a better person, as well as be stimulated by those different experiences. As opposed to in Brooklyn, I didn't have that pool or the same recreational facility or even workout. Hence, I led a different lifestyle due to my environment.
I thought you were going someplace else, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but I'll endorse what you're recommending. What you're saying is that if we standardize the inputs that are available to kids, would I endorse that? Absolutely. My friend Jeff Canada up at the Harlem Children's Zone, who's just announced that he's stepping up and doing something else for them. But Jeff believes that he and the Harlem Children's Zone ought to provide poor kids the same kinds of services that rich kids have. And I fully endorse that. He and I part company on one point. He feels it is his obligation to ensure that it happens. He's got a movie that is called Waiting for Superman, and he's kind of disparaging Superman. But I think Jeff is trying to be Superman for his kids. And I think that what he ought to be doing is helping those kids' parents and other interested adults in that community to organize themselves to demand and create those kinds of resources of their own, and not wait for Jeff and other people like Jeff to simply give them. But whether they should have them or not, absolutely. However, I thought that you were going to talk about a move that is afoot to have the United States follow some of the Scandinavian countries and begin to guarantee to every family the income that they need to live an adequate life. Now that is redistributing the wealth, but the chap who wrote the book I recently heard of and haven't read calls our attention to the fact that this isn't alien to the United States. That in Alaska, which has a rather ample income coming from oil, has a provision in its constitution that every citizen of the state of Alaska gets a check each year or month. I don't know how they distribute it. Right now, it's much too small. It's probably less than $1,800 a year. But the state is paying to its citizens money that comes from the wealth that is produced by that state. Now, if we stop letting private corporations hold on.
The capitalism. I just said capitalism.
Okay. This is my assistant here, and when she speaks, I think she's cueing me to do something. And she was just reflecting what I was saying. If we in the United States were to capture just a portion of the surplus wealth that is produced by our corporations, and particularly that is produced offshore, that is away from the country, that is not even subject to our tax code, instead of distributing that money to us stockholders and paying such enormous loot to the mismanagers of those corporations, we could distribute that among the people. Now, I'm not sure that just distributing money is going to solve the problem, because if we take the cultural piece I was just speaking to the brother back here about, we would have to have our people grow in their capacity to do what my neighbors up in Rockland County did, to recognize that their conditions of life had changed. That meant that their cultural forms could change if they wanted to move into this new world. And if you notice, my voice is running out, so I wish you would do more of the talking now.
I'll be brief.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you may be longer.
Could you share your thoughts about? Could you share your thoughts about how communities of color can associate a positive relationship with academic achievement, as opposed to us thinking about doing well in school being white?
Invited to a meeting out at UCLA, and it's on electronic games. You know, we scholars call them epistemic games. It means the games that you learn from. I thought of that as you raised your question because that would be one of the easiest, easiest avenues for us. We are lucky that there is money to be made in these games because it means that some of the brightest people in the country are now working on them and producing them. I think the current industry is commanding something like 10 to 12 trillion billion. I can no longer deal with those numbers. Anyway, a tremendous amount of money is going there. If you have young kids, most of you know that there are very, very few of them that are not hooked on these games. But in this conference I'm going to at the Center on Education and Testing, what they're trying to do is how the prevalence of those technological interventions and their use can be turned to educative purposes. And if we can take advantage of a device like that to make problem solving, to make analysis, to make synthesis, to make the generation of relationships between things fun. Even before the people were convinced that something had happened to them, something would be happening to them, because the cognitive psychologists tell us that as we engage in these kinds of activities, the mind actually changes. The capacities of mind change. Now, if we could tie that somehow with some more direct cultural interventions, and cultural doesn't quite catch it because I'm thinking about the substance that you're going to use your brain to think about. If you can, at the same time, we are sharpening the capacities of the brains of these young people, if we can get parents more hooked on the pleasure that comes from using mind to solve problems, to think about things, to appreciate beauty, to bring comfort and express compassion, those kinds of things, then I think we community people could do it. And I would use that to say that one of my major campaigns right now is to try to get communities of color to assume the responsibility for doing this for ourselves. We shouldn't wait for white people, or the rich people, or even the people who are responsible for education to do it for us, because much of this we can do.
One more question.
I just had a question about what you said about your neighbors that in Rockland that were able to go into this new culture that you were talking, and it just resonated problematic to me because do you find that there's a possibility for this new middle class or high culture to change to include things from our culture? Because you're saying not obviously the Radio City Hall, going to the opera, that's fine, but is there a place for some of our things that we hold very dear for us to join into this culture? Because I just...
Thank you for calling me on that, because I did give the impression that culture works in only one direction. But these same families are celebrating their own cultures, finding richness in them, and even expanding them. If I use that example again, I should talk about their broadening and enriching the range of their cultural expressions rather than just the point to their becoming more and more like middle-class people. But folks, thanks for letting me talk with you.